Thank you all for joining us today and weathering the weather and the commute. We really are excited to have you here with us today for a closer look after the gap. The cap, excuse me. maybe we'll be watching the gap too. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein. I'm the president of the Municipal Art Society, and for 130 years, MAS has been lifting up the voices of people in the debates that shape New York City's built environment and leading the way towards a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. Today we're gathered in our office building, the landmark Look building, which was named for its previous tenant. I bet you can guess, Look magazine. The Closer Look series features talks about policy, preservation, and planning, exploring the current and future concerns facing New York City's built environment. The program series was stalled during COVID, and we are thrilled to have you back here as we restart the series. This installment will engage leaders in land use and development for a conversation about housing in the city of Yes. The lifting of the residential FAR cap, approval of 485X tax abatement program, and the proposed City of Yes for Housing Opportunity zoning text amendments have the potential to provide New York developers with new ways to build housing. We could talk for hours on this topic, no question, but today we're just asking for an hour of your time to discuss expectations and potential outcomes of how these tools might work together and shape future development in New York, or perhaps not. Today's panel conversation will be followed by audience Q&A, and then we'll have some time for mingling and chatting with our panelists before we wrap up at 10:30. We'll have Senior Director of Land Use and Planning, Tom DeVaney, facilitating the conversation this morning. Tom will be joined by the following really exceptional panelists. First up, we have Frank Chaney, known as the zoning guy. Frank is an attorney at Rosenberg and Estis and is also a former city planner with a combined nearly 30 years of experience working in the fields of zoning and land use and planning. We're also extremely happy to have Michelle Deleuze with us today. She is the executive director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, whose mission is to advance economic, social, and racial justice in New York City through affordable housing projects and community services. And lastly, we have Basha Gerhards, who serves as the Senior Vice President of Planning with the Real Estate Board of New York, the city's leading real estate trade association. In her work, Basha focuses on topics related to housing, land use, zoning, resilience, and community development in the city at the state level and also at the federal level. Thank you all in advance, Michelle, Frank, and Basha, for lending your expertise and perspectives to this conversation. Without further ado, please come join us, and Tom, you can take it away. That's off again.
I'll sit on
Wait,
the
you want to do that one?
far end.
Okay, you got the far end.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So the idea for this discussion really came about this past spring after the state budget was passed. It was after a MAS Planning Committee meeting, and I was speaking with experienced planners and developers and attorneys, and when we were discussing the lifting of the FAR cap, 421A tax abatement replacement, City of Yes, and we all had the same question: what now? And I think a lot of people have that question. And some of you may have participated in the marathon public hearing on City of Yes a couple weeks ago that lasted till 1 a.m. And we had a outpouring of interest in this session. So we know that there's a lot of questions about all of these issues that seem to come in a big wave over the past year or so. So I'm really delighted to have our panelists here because, number one, even though they have expertise in real estate and law and housing, they're all in one form or another been planners. So we expect a very rational the discussion tonight. So let's get right to it. I'm going to start with Frank, and these questions are for all of you, but I want to start with you, Frank, because you are the zoning guy. Do you agree with the premise that restrictive and outdated zoning regulations have stifled housing production and is one of the primary reasons we are in such profound housing crisis?
I agree. Is it?
Oh, yeah, turn that on.
There we go. In part. You know, zoning isn't the be-all and end-all of it. And we know that because in the past we've seen zoning initiatives come along intending to have a particular result, and they don't. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. But I do think that there have been aspects of the zoning resolution that have depressed housing production in the city, and the primary way in which that happened, in my opinion, that during the 12 years of the Bloomberg administration, city planning undertook 120 rezonings, the overwhelming majority of which were downzonings in Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, which essentially shrink-wrapped the zoning down around the existing context. Something like 86% of the almost 500,000 properties that were rezoned were either density was not increased or decreased. So that, in my view, contributed to the problem. Fortunately, I think the City of Yes is doing a fair amount to correct that problem.
Sure. Basha, Michelle?
So I think it may seem odd to talk about a sweater on a day like today, but similar to the shrink wrap theory, you know, there used to be a zoning sweater, and in 1961, the capacity of that sweater was basically you threw the sweater into the dryer by accident and shrunk the capacity for the city to house its people by 80%. And then all the downzonings that Frank mentioned, the contextual zonings, all of these different changes that grew our zoning resolution from a couple of hundred pages to over a couple thousand pages, all of those things have limited where housing can go and who can build where and what. And I want us, again, to think about a sweater on a day like today. When that sweater's too tight, where does the housing go? And our zoning, in a lot of ways with City of Yes, I think they're really trying to unravel that sweater, kind of stretch it back out, but we're still working within the bones of that 1961 zoning resolution that predicated parking over people, that predicated this idea of separation of uses, and this idea that we don't actually want as many people in the city as maybe we had envisioned when the city was founded or when the 1916 zoning resolution was adopted.
I mean, the only thing I would add, because I agree with both of what has been said already, you know, zoning is really a reflection of the beliefs, values, biases, and goals of their time. And I think the housing crisis and the affordable housing crisis, and I purposely said two different words there, housing and then affordable housing, because although they overlap, they are different. You know, it's now it used to be that it was really poor and working class people who were really impacted by the housing crisis or needed affordable housing. That's no longer the case, right? It is such, you know, when we are organizing in buildings now, in rent stabilized buildings, we have middle income rent stabilized tenants with low income rent stabilized tenants, and they're all facing a lot of the same issues. People are now seeing that, you know, that the crisis impacts them. And so there's a greater belief that we need broader tools, or the tools need to reflect the needs of this moment in time and the crises that we are facing today.
Thank you. You know, I think we can all agree that zoning is a tool that has its limits. Basha, the other day when we spoke, you said that zoning is not an affordable housing program, and it really resonated. So, with all of these things considered, what other things need to happen, such as funding, incentives, to form the nexus which puts the city in the best position to to feasibly grow and add the type of housing that New Yorkers need.
So I think Howard Slacken actually at that 15-hour hearing, which for the record is the longest city planning hearing I believe ever.
12 was the longest.
15 hours. Howard Slacken from Citizens Housing and Planning Council described it best by saying zoning needs to be a box in which all of the other programs can fit. So now we have various tools. We have 485X, we have the deadline extension for 421A for those projects that were previously vested but need more time. We have all of the city's existing term sheets. We have 420C and Article 11, and Michelle can speak to the viability of all these things. We have tools, and so now the question is, are those tools good enough? Is zoning flexible enough those tools can actually fit into the box, or have we, again, shrunk our sweater so much that we can't fit those things? And I think where we really start to see the rub in all of that is with the setting of AMIs. And Michelle and I got into like a bit of a disagreement, but a rational one, about AMI growth over time and what does that mean. When the zoning starts setting AMIs, is it setting a floor or is it setting a ceiling? And is it going to be flexible enough over time as those AMIs change? Center for Urban Future talked about, now you need $100,000 in order to exist in this city and not be rent burden. It used to be you needed $75,000 or $50,000. So this idea that affordability is only for lowest income New Yorkers, that's not true anymore. And our zoning, is that going to keep pace? And do the tax tools that have just been created for 485X, there's a lot of talk about it setting an 80% AMI citywide. It sets 60% as the weighted average within the two wage zones, including in neighborhoods where market rate rents are still not what we think about for Manhattan. And so then we get into the question of math.
Michelle, you were shaking your head a little bit there, so.
Yeah,
that's the
Basha
question.
set me up, yeah. So, I mean, HPD has, this is inside baseball, right? So HPD hasn't updated their term sheets in years, okay? And so that's an issue, and it's causing a lot of delay, and of course, OMB decides that they want to re-underwrite every single project that goes, affordable housing project that goes before them. I mean, that's a huge inefficiency that needs to change, and it adds to the costs. But to the AMI point, and so in 2017, when Affordable New York was passed, with the AMI level, maximum AMI level of 130% of AMI, can anybody tell me what 130% of AMI was in 2017? Not allowed to look at my cheat sheet.
And not me.
Anybody?
I know what it is now.
I know, okay, so what is it now?
182,000 for a family of three.
That's today. You are right. It's 100. Yes.
I rounded it off.
Exactly. You rounded it off. It's 182,000 for a family of three. But in 2017, it was basically 112,000 for a family of three. Right, and the maximum monthly rent for that household would be $2,733. Anybody want to guess what 80% of AMI is today? It's $112,000. So basically, 130% of AMI in 2017 is equal to 80% of AMI today. And actually, the maximum rent is actually slightly more today at 80% of AMI than it was in 2017 and at 130% of AMI. So the AMI growth, we got to do a little bit of myth busting about, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, AMI has dropped from 130% of AMI to 80% of AMI. AMI has really grown, and so, and we need to make sure that whatever public policy is incentivizing is helping actually meet our housing need, rather than increasing market in certain neighborhoods. So that's an important piece. But I think part of your question was what else needs to happen? And so I mentioned we need more certainty on the affordable housing side of things. We need more certainty and we need more transparency, right? We have a pipeline at HPD that's 4 or 5 years long. I just this week, we have a Fifth Avenue committee. We develop and preserve affordable housing. We have a 2,000 unit pipeline, nearly $1 billion, we do a lot of preservation work. We reached out to HPD about when are we be able to get us a project manager assigned for a preservation project? 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months. So this isn't working, right? Like how it's currently structured isn't working. And it's part of the impediment to actually building and preserving affordable housing in New York City. So we need to have greater efficiencies and greater certainty.
I'm a zoning guy, not a housing guy, so, you know.
We work together.
Yeah. But as a former city planner working at the Department of City Planning, you know, I've always thought, and I was talking about this with someone beforehand, that part of the problem, the housing problem in the city, but nationally really, is that, but particularly with regard to New York City, is that we have for too long kind of relied upon the private sector to solve the problem for us. Some modest subsidies here and there, but basically we look to the private sector to build the housing and solve our problem for us. And some of us remember the days when the federal government was heavily involved in housing production. And I think that without that kind of support at a federal level, everybody just kind of walked away from it. The feds walked away from it and let the states do it. Then the state walked away and said, let the city deal with it. And the city kind of said, well, let the private sector deal with it. I think we need the deep involvement of all levels of government, all the way up to the federal government, to help solve the problem, because it's essentially a money problem as much as anything else.
Political will and money.
Yes.
They go together. Just to put into context, right, 90% of multifamily loans used to be underwritten by the federal government. When we were hitting the production goals we're talking about in terms of like our, you know, the mayor's moonshot or the governor's moonshot of 500,000 units for New York City over the next 10 years. We used to be hitting 300,000 units a year. But that was when, again, the federal government was underwriting 90% of the loans. That's not the case at all today. And even though New York City and New York State spends more on affordable housing than nearly every other city and state in the country, it's still not enough. The city and the state are able to produce about 30% of what the private sector is able to do.
I want to follow up. Don't put that microphone down yet. I want to follow up on two things. One of that you said, Michelle, about the definition of affordable housing, but Basha, I have a question for you. With the 485X tax abatement in place, developers gain 5 years in duration of the tax benefit, but there's a pretty significant change in the maximum area median income from 130% to 80%, and with the prevailing wage, construction costs are going to be higher. How much does lifting the residential FAR cap sort of soften the blow of those concessions?
So a couple of things to keep in mind. Even though AMI growth has happened, and Michelle like very aptly pointed out, like I would say in some ways what seems like massive jumps in those AMI bands, and the 80% being the equivalent of 130 just, you know, not that long ago. In that same time period, we now have inflation the highest it's been in my lifetime, and interest rates the highest they've been in my professional career. So on a macro level, that math becomes that much harder. Land prices have not dropped, they've only gone up, and labor, Tom, as you pointed out, has also gone up. Some of the labor increases we're looking at in these particular wage zones under 485X range anywhere from a 20% to a 50% increase. So this is increasing your total construction cost between, you say, 10 to 25%. That's a big jump in what it means to produce housing with, again, what's important to keep in mind with affordable housing, we're talking about income restricted housing where those rents are going to, at some point, if not very early on, fall below the operating cost of that unit and your debt service. So you're talking about permanently restricting the rent growth on those units, and there's a lot of really good public policy reasons to do that and really important public policy reasons to do that. But then it gets back to that math question. What does floor area cost? How much of a bump that is? The lifting of the 12 FAR cap has nothing to do with 485X. Frank should really talk about what it's going to take for people to go in and do private rezonings, whether people are going to do that, whether the city is going to do that. But right now that just exists on paper. So is that density enough? Is it? Maybe. I think that's part of the fun of all of this from an urban planning perspective, right? We're making our best guesses on what we think the industry needs, or what the city needs, or what the developers need in order to produce what we actually need, which is more housing and affordable housing. And are those guesses right? And it's not necessarily based on rational land use planning. It's based on politics and who was screaming loudest, or who was writing the bigger checks to various political officials. All of those things kind of feed into, did we get any of this right?
Well, since you brought up the FAR cap, in terms of zoning and how that happens, one of the things we talked about before was, where were these rezonings to the new high-density zoning districts? Who's going to undertake those? Is it going to be the private sector, or is the city going to undertake neighborhood-wide rezonings to do that? I wrote this down because I wanted to be sure I quoted it correctly. This was from the city's press release after they announced that they were going to create these new high-density zones, that they would be mapped, quote, where they are needed most, quote unquote, and then in certain high-demand areas of the city that working-class New Yorkers are unable to afford, and then Midtown Manhattan. I think that whether Midtown Manhattan is a place where most working-class families would want to live is debatable. But, in my office, we undertook a very rough study, and we used city planning's Pluto data to do an analysis, and we just looked at every single property in Manhattan between 14th Street and 59th Street from river to river. And we said, okay, if every single one of those properties was maxed out at 12 FAR, what would you get? And then we said, what if they're all maxed out at 18 FAR? What would you get, and what would be the difference? Our study found, and that's a very rough study, it would be a maximum of slightly less than 40,000 dwelling units. That's very, very rough. We know it's not going to be that. So raising the FAR cap is not going to be the solution to the city's housing problem. It might help in some ways, but it comes back to the question, in my mind at any rate, if you try to make Midtown Manhattan a place where working class families can live, think about all the other things that are going to have to consider. Grocery stores. I walk around Midtown Manhattan, how many Gristedes do you see? There's a Whole Foods on 57th Street.
But there's a Whole Foods in Lower Manhattan now too,
yes.
right? Like
around the corner from the stock exchange.
all right, exactly.
Right. But for the most part, the kinds of commercial uses and storefronts that working class families would want to have in their communities are basically missing there. And then you also have the consideration of if you make Midtown Manhattan a residential area for working class families, what happens to all the businesses? So I'm not sure that raising the FAR cap. I have no problem with it from the perspective of, in Midtown Manhattan, as many people know, commercial uses are already allowed at 15, 18, 21 FAR, and in East Midtown, perhaps even higher than that. So if you're going to allow 18 FAR for commercial uses, you might as well allow it for residential uses as well, because we're really talking about bulk and the size of buildings. And if you're going to allow a certain size of building for one use, okay, it seems reasonable to allow it for residential use. But I don't think it's going to be the panacea that it was kind of made out to be.
I want to follow that up with a little bit of what previous question we talked about affordable housing. I mean, the numbers most people know the numbers. We have the lowest vacancy rate since 1968, 1.4%. In 2021, it was 4.5%. So there's been a precipitous drop off. 30% of New Yorkers spend 50% of their income on rent, and market rents have increased by 36% since 2015. In City of Yes, the city, in planning parlance, the city has talks about the missing middle, which is a housing typology, somewhere between single-family homes and multifamily homes. But there's also socioeconomically a missing middle in New York City, and you know, you don't have to be a low-income family to feel the crunch, and the numbers speak to that. So with working families and middle-class families who are quite literally a paycheck away from financial disaster, how can we best ensure that if these tools are successful in increasing housing supply, that most of it doesn't end up as luxury, high-end housing? I think I can speak for a lot of New Yorkers in the sense, you get the sense living here that there's always somebody who can pay that high price. So what can we, I'm looking for some thoughts on that. Maybe not solutions, but.
Well, okay, now here we go.
There you go.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's about, you know, what are the programs and the tax policy that need to accompany the zoning to accomplish those things. That's critical, and you know, obviously, whether it's the commercial to residential conversions, and you know, the city obviously needs to focus on that. You know, whether it's the ADU piece of the puzzle here, which actually represents, you know, as part of City of Yes, about half of all the units that are supposedly going to be created through the City of Yes are going to come through accessory dwelling units. And, you know, homeowners in 1 to 4 family properties are, you know, this is not something they deal with every day. And so it's critical that the city invest, well, a couple of things. One is, I think they really need to create typical design guidelines for ADUs that are going to be applicable to the various types. That way, just to simplify it for a lot of folks. And you kind of like need an off-the-shelf approach. You know, I think Fifth Avenue Committee does a lot of organizing in working class immigrant communities where folks are doubled up, tripled up, quadrupled up, you know, in homes that are owned, and a lot of, you know, a lot of illegal basement living and kind of things like that. And so I think it's critical that there's funding for technical assistance and outreach that's linguistically and culturally competently delivered by local organizations. I think that there's going to need to be, you know, funding and subsidy of some sort, in particular for moderate and middle income homeowners to take advantage of this. I think that's the only way that's going to happen, I think, for like swaths of the city in order to realize that. And then, you know, I mentioned already, you know, basically the shackles have to come off of HPD. And more work that HPD is trying to do needs to be done by partners. You know, whether that's the intermediaries like Liskin Enterprise, or by nonprofit partners, or by, you know, WBEs. Like, you know, the city's not able to keep up, basically, and that's a huge, huge problem.
Once you build the affordable units, allowing people to move in quickly is also really important. The lottery process, 272 days. We are still arguing with Con Ed to get electric hookup to a residential building that includes mixed income rental apartments for nearly 2 years. So it's not just a New York City problem or a private sector problem or an affordable housing provider problem or a tenant problem. Literally everyone looking at every single process and being like, why are we doing it this way? just because we've been doing it this way for however many decades or years or what have you.
Lottery's more recent.
Right. They're like, let's redo a process. The sake of changing things for the sake of changing them is not necessarily the right way either. The sake of standardization for the sake of standardization is not appropriate. But we haven't really looked at all of these different pieces and said to everyone, how can you fix what the problem is when everyone knows what it is? We've everyone's been talking about it over various panels. Like, they brought in a housing czar who said, I need to fix the lottery, and then she left after 2 years, and the lottery is the same. The voucher process is broken. All of these different things have to be fixed if we're actually going to start getting people into those units once we build them.
Here, here.
Yeah, I would agree. I think process plays a big part in all of this, and in some small ways, the city, the Department of City Planning particularly, has looked at that. And for example, they recently adopted a rule with regard to ULURP, the land use review procedure, that you would only have to provide, the applicants would only have to submit one draft ULURP application, and then it would be certified. In the past, you had to submit 3, 4. I had a project recently that was a project in Brooklyn with 30% affordable housing, a fresh food store. It was in pre-ULURP for a year and a half. We submitted six draft versions of the ULURP application. And this is for a project that was going to be built on a parking lot that for a half a century had no housing on it whatsoever. So, almost 400 dwelling units, 30% of which would be affordable, plus a fresh food store. You'd think, man, everybody would want that. City planning would just push that through, but it took almost a year and a half. So they've adopted this new rule that only one draft application is required. Hopefully that will work and shorten the time. And then you've got the green fast track, which remains to be seen whether that will really speed things up or not. But they understand, I think, that there's a problem with process, and that same way that city planning is looking at their processes sounds like HPD and other city agencies need to do the same.
Yes.
Well, speaking of process, with the lifting of the cap in mind, particularly, and the current mayor has made it a big part of the platform is to cut the red tape of the environmental review process. Doesn't the idea that, with the lifting of the cap, you have to rezone in order to get the extra density and the possibility of additional city neighborhood rezonings, wouldn't that be inconsistent with cutting the red tape of secret? Because are we going to see a flurry of applications from the private sector? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. Basha might be able to speak to that. My sense of it is that we're not going to see a flurry of private applications. But one of the things that the Department of City Planning could do, and to be honest with you, I'm a little surprised that they didn't include it in the housing opportunity, is getting back to Midtown, which is where city planning envisioned these high-density zones being mapped. Certain of you will know that in Midtown, there's a section of the zoning regulations for Midtown that contains a fairly extensive table of the allowable FARs under different circumstances and in different zoning districts, all of which are commercial. And those FARs, which 15, 18 in the East Midtown, even more, apply only to commercial or non-residential developments. All city planning would have to do is do a text amendment to make those FARs applicable to residential development. So I'm a little surprised they didn't do it, and I think they could do that. In terms of private applications, it would really depend on the site, what's there now, what's to be gained by the upzoning, and does that gain offset the 2-year or so cost of undertaking a rezoning? But I think and it's not just Midtown. The same thing in the Lower Manhattan Special District, Hudson Yards, all have their own special zoning tables, and a text amendment could make the super high density 15 to 18 FAR, R11 and R12 zones applicable in those. So I think it could be done.
Super wonky and in the weeds, but in the MDL, when they lifted the 12 FAR cap, they didn't lift it. They said the city can, with a bunch of language, basically do a ULURP. And because a text amendment isn't considered a full ULURP, they were hesitant as part of City of Yes Housing Opportunity to go in and do, as Frank aptly outlined, is just a text amendment. So there's some thinking that they're going to actually have to go in to Hudson Yards, to Lower Manhattan, to Midtown, to Long Island City, where, you know, we requested as part of the scoping for Midtown South, they actually look at including the new R11 and R12 districts that they are talking about in City of Yes, because they have to go in and do a zoning map change and trigger that full ULURP and the full environmental review as part of the couple of lines that were added into the MDL. It was not a simple, like, go ahead and go forth and have control over your density. For individual developers, I think, to Frank's point, like, it's really site specific. For some folks, you know, we're hearing a lot of excitement about 485X with the alignment with that, and again, the zoning under universal affordability preference, where the requirements of 485X with the AMI bands and the percent shares will align really well with that universal affordability preference, and they don't have to go in and do a rezoning because they're already in a non-contextual higher density district, and now they'll be able to align those two pieces, and it's going to work. Our chair and our former chair have been incredibly vocal that 485X absolutely does not 100% work for their sites, and in fairness to both of them, they undertook extensive, long, lengthy, involved ULURP processes for large scales on the waterfront, and this is not helpful at all. Will they have different views a few years from now as they see other people maybe go in and map the R11 and the R12 districts? Maybe. Certainly going to encourage them to take another look, because I don't think the city can afford the loss of 1,000, you know, really a 1,200 unit project on the Brooklyn waterfront. And will there be enough of these smaller rezonings, so to speak, you know, where people are going to try and get under that seeker threshold of 250 units and kind of hit that sweet spot between the different parameters under 485X? Will we see 100 of those projects to offset the loss of 1,200? I don't know.
I mean, I would just say, I defer to both of you in this area. This is, you know, Fifth Avenue Committee is generally not involved in projects that are FAR, you know, above 12, although we have worked with Alloy in their downtown Brooklyn project, the fully electric 80 and 100 Flatbush buildings. So I think you're right that this analysis has to be done, and I think this is actually where some of the follow-up is, I think, in like unpacking all of this in a very, very detailed level for owners. To help them navigate this and then see if it's going to make sense. I think, of course, interest rates are going to play a factor here. Like right now, with where interest rates are at, people might be like, this is not the time. And, you know, if the Fed really does lower rates in September and beyond, like that might intense, you know, the water might seem warm enough to come in, kind of a thing, at a later date. So let's, you know, I think it's going to be a wait and see, except I don't want to wait too much. I want to like proactively like provide information to people to kind of unpack these pieces.
We definitely want to leave some time for questions from the audience. Genevieve, how much time do I have with the panel?
I think I have
One more question. Okay.
Make it a good one, Tom. No pressure.
What's great about you guys is that, like, I have all these questions, but in the conversation you've already answered a lot of them. So the last question is a two-pronged one. The first part of it is, what are the reasons we should be concerned that these tools and incentives won't give us sufficient housing to get us out of the housing crisis? And to end on a positive note, what are the reasons to be optimistic?
I'll be happy to take that. So I already mentioned interest rates. So, you know, if interest rates stay as high as they are and construction costs stay as high as they are, that is pause, and that's going to, and you know, insurance costs. like all of those things stay very, very high. A lot of these things, you know, that we're planning won't happen or won't happen anytime soon. In terms of reason for optimism, for me, it's like there are more people who understand the problems and the complexities of the problems and are willing to see change. And like you can't underestimate that. You really cannot underestimate people being willing to go through change for themselves, their communities, for the city, as an impetus to say, okay, we can do this, we can handle this. So for me, those are the main things.
So I would put in the pessimism column definitely the macroeconomics that we're dealing with right now, and the unpredictability that comes from introducing a new program, right? We still need rulemaking from the city. We may see that in the next 3 months to a year, hopefully not 18 to 24 months, but you know, that industry needs predictability before they dip their toe in and before you start seeing, I would say, momentum of people trying out new tools and doing that. On the optimism side, I think the last time I sat in person at an MAS panel, there was not a universal agreement that we needed more housing. There was a lot of folks arguing about like, well, I don't like that building and I don't want this. And you heard a lot of that at that 15-hour hearing. But even groups who I would say historically have been very much, I don't like tall buildings, they came in with thoughtful comments. It was, I may not like the tall building, but I understand we need the housing, so can you amend the proposal in this particular way? And I think giving a path forward for how we fix things, that gave me a lot of optimism.
Yeah, you know, the FAR cap is kind of the thing that gets a lot of attention. We tend to focus on Manhattan and the high density portions of the city. But what gives me hope and optimism is that in terms of the housing opportunity zoning text amendments at any rate, the majority of it is focused on low density areas of the city. Those areas that for 12 years the city spent downzoning them. So there's a combination of things that are all going to happen in these low density zoning districts. Number one, the FARs are going to be increased across the board. What used to be 0.5 FAR will now be 0.75. What used to be 0.75 will be 1, etc. So an increase in floor ratio. The ADUs, which anecdotally I know of people in LA and Denver who have used that to create new dwelling units for their elderly parents, for their autistic son. These can be very helpful in terms of creating more dwelling units. Decreases in the minimum lot size, decreases in the minimum lot width requirements, yards, parking. All of these things combined will affect the low density portions of the city far more than they'll affect Manhattan. And per a Furman Center study, which I read recently, 45% of the city is zoned for R5 or lower. 45% of the city, that 45% currently contains only 28% of the population. So, and those are the areas I think which will be key for providing housing for working class families. So I'm hopeful and optimistic. I was initially a little skeptical of the City of Yes, but the more I looked at it, the more impressed I became by how much they have simplified it, consolidated it. 4 floor area tables have been reduced to 1. A lot of redundancy has been eliminated. So I'm cautiously hopeful. The city is projecting, 110,000 dwelling units, a very modest increase. I would hope that it would be more than that, all things considered.
Yeah, that was one of the, it's a very, considering all of the hearings and the page numbers, it's 150,000 units, roughly 20% would be affordable. As Elizabeth said at the beginning of this, we could have, this could be an all-day conference. There's so many issues that we could get into, but I wanted to get to some questions in the audience. Actually, I'll go around.
Sure.
I need to get off the stool anyway. I feel like $100.
I moved to New York in 1984. It's always been expensive to live here. It's never been affordable, ever. My kids just went through it. It's not affordable. So, in the absence of federal subsidy, and that started to decline during the Reagan administration, who sort of worked to wipe it out. That was '84 kind of happening at that point. And the cities that have affordable housing have huge government programs to support them, particularly in Europe. In the absence of big federal subsidies, in the absence of commitment by organized labor to reduce the costs of construction, in the absence of a concerted government effort to reduce red tape, but too many people make money off of the red tape, so I think it's a catch-22. I supported Governor Pataki's effort to reduce rent regulation, but 30 years later, it hasn't worked. New York is not more affordable, so why should I believe that City of Yes is really going to change the paradigm in the absence of all these other things? Density to me is not the enemy. Ugly buildings are the enemy. Hudson Yards, Long Island City. Who the hell wants to live in a place that looks like that?
I guess you're on the pessimistic side of things. Yeah, no, listen, I call myself a pragmatic idealist. Like, we actually do the work in my organization where policy and projects meet with community. That's the nexus that we are at. So to me, you just named all the things that we need to work on. Like, that is really what you've named. Like, we can't give up on all those things, because then that's just saying the status quo is okay, and it's not okay.
As someone who lived in Long Island City, I think what we miss in our big, beautiful city is not everyone wants to live in the same type of neighborhood. And I think what's been missing in a lot of these conversations is, are we providing access and opportunity? Putting aside all the different regulations and all the different things, City of Yes for the first time is taking a holistic look at introducing lots of different housing types back into the zoning resolution. And I think that's so important. There was this one lady at the hearing who was very much against ADUs, but it was a funny exchange, because she said she was sick of her son living with her, and she wanted him out. And one of the commissioners asked, well, if this passes, you could build an ADU for him. She's like, no, I want him out and off my property and away. And then someone else said, well, this will also increase housing in like high density areas and the conversions. And she's like, oh, everyone loved conversions. That was very, fulfilling to hear. But I think this idea, like, we need housing of all types in all places, and the fact that most of our city is considered suburban, and you had multiple people talking about it being suburban, was so, as someone who loves skyscrapers, like, it was so, okay, well, sure, we can have room for that too, but should that be nearly half of our land mass?
Yeah, I would just again say that to kind of touch on what Basha talked about earlier about pre-61 and even 61 in the early years, zoning was a kind of a big envelope, a roomy dress or a sweater that you could grow, that you could grow out into. And I think what makes me hopeful about City of Yes, just from a zoning perspective, is that there's a kind of recognition that we need to go, after 12 years of shrink wrapping zoning, we need to expand the zoning envelope. We need to allow greater density across the board in all zoning districts. We have to create opportunities for different types of housing, and I think city planning sees that, and I think City of Yes is making some very solid steps towards returning to that bigger envelope.
Great, so we've got a question here and a question here, and I think, questions in the back, so I think we'll end with you. All right.
All right. Thank you. You took the words out of my mouth. I moved here 20 years ago. The city, my rent doubled from Washington, D.C. My salary did not double. But New York City has always been expensive, and my conclusion is that a good part of our problem is that New York has a lot of people with ability to pay. As you said, there's always somebody who's going to come along and pay up. You talked about the AMI increases. And so, and I'm wondering about the percentage of people with ability to pay versus the housing supply increases. So you said as a maximum city of yes, you might get 40,000 units if we're optimistic, optimistically.
That was the Midtown. No, 110 to 150.
Right. No, but I mean, our housing production per year right now is like 20,000 units. Maybe it'll increase annually to more. I bet every month, maybe every week, we have speculators or millionaires who are looking at the city. We may have 20,000 people a week looking at New York City, looking at how to invest or to purchase a home, who can purchase for 2-3 million. When you upzone these neighborhoods, they're going to look straight at those neighborhoods. So I think my feeling is you have to add another layer onto this growth, is how do you curb speculation to keep the prices from being driven up? Because I'm not certain the prices are going to go down.
Yeah. No, I think you make a very, very good point. And we've seen this across the country where private equity is purchasing 1 to 4 and and now multifamily properties. In my organization, we do we specifically do tenant organizing in rent stabilized buildings that have been targeted by private equity investors, and have pushed for legislation at the state and at federal level to try to curb this, and we definitely need that. I mean, we had the LLC transparency bill pass the state, but then the governor, decided to not quite make it fully transparent, which makes it difficult. So there's more to do, and you're absolutely bringing up a very, very good point. Like, everyday people cannot compete with private equity, and I would just say too, there's the housing vacancy survey also takes a look at how many pied-à-terres exist in this city, right? Like we need to tax those differently, honestly, and like have that go into a pool for affordable housing, so that that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. And as an affordable housing advocate, that's part of it.
When you look at municipalities that have added a lot of housing, and I think I want to do a little myth busting as well. Like, rents are never rolling back because property taxes are not rolling back, and insurance costs are not rolling back, and labor costs are not rolling back. Can we slow rent growth? Can we make rent growth reasonable as compared to all of the other basket of goods that the Consumer Price Index measures? Yes, if you add enough supply. And I think we see this over and over again nationally, that where they've made a lot of concentrated effort at adding supply at all income levels, rent growth, so New Rochelle's a good example of this, increased their housing by 12%, rent went up 7% as compared to the rest of the state where it went up 22%. So we really need to focus on, like, from, again, speaking from the real estate lens, is everyone going to work together to build a lot more housing in all these different neighborhoods at all these different types? That citywide vacancy rate of 1.41%, when you start looking at the higher rent apartments, which used to have vacancy rates closer to 7 to 8%, which is considered healthy, they're also near 1%. So this idea of like, oh, if we only build apartments that are for only the lowest income New Yorkers, this is going to solve our crisis, I really don't think that's true whatsoever.
No comment, Frank? I
I'll leave it
don't
there.
want to put the pressure on you. All right.
Hi. There's several issues. Regional issues, demographic issues. We now have a third of our families are single family people. Another great group, more than a quarter, are people living together that are unrelated. And so the families that we seem to be wanting to make better with our ADUs are very few people now. 17% in New York City. So I think we have to make the regions and New Jersey.
Shake it.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, do better, and I don't know how we do that. Density is important, and zoning has to accept the fact that it should really increase greatly, and then let planners make sure that they get the mix, because housing is not only housing, it's all the needs of a community, including open space and community services. So I think that zoning, density, and funding honestly stopped in 1973 and from the federal government, and they have not done as much since then. So all of those issues are issues, especially the regional and the demographics, I'd like you to discuss.
Oh, do you want to discuss it? Do you want to discuss the regional piece?
You're putting the pressure on me.
You're right, you're right.
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's not just a New York problem, right? I think people all over the New York tri-state region are feeling the crunch. I can't really speak. I mean, there is a lack of regional planning in the area, and so you know, we live in a little bit of a bubble in New York, but if you go out to Long Island, you go out to areas of New Jersey that are along the New Jersey Transit line, it's the same issues of affordability. I can speak the problem in, say, Long Island is if you're a developer and you go for a board, or you go for the public, and you try to get a rental apartment building approved, they'll come out with pitchforks and run you out on a rip.
I dealt with that in '73,
Yeah.
and we had to have people with guns come to hearings in Westchester. And that has to change, because if they're going to use New York City, they have to.
But you're sort of, there's the problem, right? You're saying this has been around since '73.
That's right.
And so the problem may lie in communities and how, you know, in programs and whatnot to bring in the kind of, or to at least release the stigma of affordable housing. We have time for one more question. Oh, sorry.
Really quickly add, I would love to see much more aggressive and use and enforcement of our fair housing laws at the state and federal level. That is how affordable housing got built in Westchester. That is how affordable housing got built in New Jersey. And if we want everyone, not just New York City, to do their part, then again, political will needs to look at these communities and say, please stop talking about sewage every time someone brings up adding housing or parking, and saying, here's the money, we will build a new whatever tank, I forget the septic tank, and every time I had to go up to Albany and you're passing all of these Metro North stations and the entire ride I'm going soft site, soft site, soft site, soft site, because it's parking, acres of it, next to a Metro North station. Yeah.
I was going to say the same thing. Like, basically, you know, that was a reflection of systemic racism, and it's still alive and well today. And I think we need to, you know, make sure we name it that, so that we're clear about that. And I mean, obviously, you know, the governor's approach to try to have pro-housing communities is a piece of that. And again, the fact that more people are having this conversation, more people are kind of understanding the root causes of these things, I think is helpful. It at least unmasks the reality of what's going on.
We have one last question. I've requested that a short one.
And I'm here to oblige. What is causing the shrink? I'm stymied to hear that the zoning is kind of being compressed, and your sweater analogy is very apt, very compelling. What's going on?
Well, as I said, I think for a number of years, more than a decade, the city engaged in a series of rezonings to shrink wrap the zoning around the existing context. And now they're kind of recognizing, and I've had former city planning colleagues who are still at city planning acknowledge to me that in fact was probably a mistake. Why did it happen? Because it was
there wasn't a focus on equity. There wasn't
Right.
a focus on fairness.
and it was a political response, to be real blunt about it. Down zonings were popular in these neighborhoods, and the elected officials knew that, and they engaged in these down zonings because it made people happy and resulted in votes. So not to sound terribly cynical, but that is a fact and a reality of it. So now I think they've recognized the error of their ways in that respect. And as I said, a large proportion of the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity zoning amendments focus on these low density areas. And I think, in addition to the federal government, a friend and a former city planning colleague, we worked together in the Brooklyn office of city planning, moved out to California, is now head of an affordable housing development company in San Diego. And we've had some interesting conversations about the differences between California's approach to housing and New York's approach to housing. California has been for decades now focused on the housing issue, and the state of California provides a significant amount of money towards various housing programs. New York State hasn't done that. I was kind of hopeful with Governor Hochul's proposals a year or two ago. That didn't fly, but I think California, if you're interested in where New York could go or should go, take a look at what California is doing.
Well, on that note, I want to. Right, I was going to mention that the 28% of the population that lives in the low density areas, I think all of them spoke at the City of Yes public hearing, and weren't necessarily in favor of it. So with that, I want to pass the mic to Elizabeth and for final notes, final comments.
Well, I want to thank all of you for this very important conversation. We've got a lot of talking to do, and perhaps more importantly, a lot of advocating to do. Having grown up in a Mitchell Lama project in the Bronx and lived in a pre-gentrified brownstone neighborhood in Brooklyn, and now living in Jackson Heights, I will say that I have sampled the city, and there are many, many fabulous places to live here, and there will come many fabulous places to live here. I have no doubt, with all these smart minds on this question. I do think that none of us will walk away without Basha's sweater analogy in our head forever. Thank you for that, Basha. But I do, all kidding aside, I do think that this dialogue and the knowledge that people are growing right now to understand the complexities of this issue are so important. And so we thank you for coming here to join us to start MAS's conversation in this regard. It will not be the last. We very much appreciate our colleagues from the planning division and the programs division for putting this program together, and for all of you for coming. I hope you'll keep your eye on the MAS website for future programming, and please have a bagel before you go. Thank you all. Good morning.